Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you today about what's happening to intellectuals. To tune out those who've been before, I'm a erstwhile biochemist pediatrician, mainly pediatrician, who was pulled out of his ivory tower by a bunch of people who didn't believe, and I've ended up having a third career in my life talking about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy, which is what I'm doing now in one way or another. So I want to talk to you about an amazing phenomenon. Just last week or so, I came across the fact that Neil Ferguson, he pronounces it, but spelt Niall, has acknowledged the need for Christianity and says he's a lapsed atheist who now goes to church regularly, enjoys it. He's married to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was born in Somalia and escaped an arranged marriage by running away from the family in Schiphol airport and got into Holland, eventually became an MP in Holland, and then came to America. But then she became very, very depressed. Everything was dark and gloomy. And she'd married Neil Ferguson, and it was devastating. And then she met Christ in a very real way. And you can read her descriptions of it or listen to it. It's better to listen to. You'll find her describing it on YouTube. And of course, Neil Ferguson witnessed this, and he got his life back. And I imagine that would make most men thoughtful, at least. And I'm going to read a little bit to you because it's quite short, but it was published some time ago, just to tell you that this over the last 5 years or so has been happening. But his turn to Christianity happened in the last week or two in an open way. So this is Andrew Wilson writing, and said, "This is a remarkable conversation with Neil Ferguson on the need for Christianity, along with some fascinating reflections on the journeys of other public intellectuals like Roger Scruton, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, and Jordan Peterson. There are echoes, too, of Matthew Parris's Times column on Saturday, in which he argued that human rights are neither fundamental nor unalienable without a Christian foundation." That's really worth thinking about. You cannot get from a statement in the indicative tense to one in the sense of being a command. There's no route. Lewis deals with it very well and effectively in The Abolition of Man, written in the 1940s. It's not logically possible to get from physical facts to moral facts. They're both factual. They have to be. The world is changing. And this author says, "I was struck by this line in particular from Ferguson. Viewing Western civilization with its Christian soul cut out, many are now willing to say, we need Christ. What they are unable thus far to say is, I need Christ. Have a look." This is Neil Ferguson. "I was brought up an atheist. I didn't become one. I regard atheism as the religious faith I happen to be brought up in. It is, of course, as much a faith as Christianity or Islam, and I have the Calvinist brand because my parents left the Church of Scotland. I was brought up essentially in a Calvinist ethical framework, but with no God. This had its benefits. I was encouraged to think in a very critical way about religion, also about science. But I've come to see, as a historian, that you can't base a society on that. Indeed, atheism, particularly in its militant forms, is really a very dangerous metaphysical framework for a society. I know I can't achieve religious faith," he went on, "but I do think we should go to church. We don't have, I think, an evolved ethical system. I don't buy the idea that evolution alone gets us to be moral. It can modify behavior, but there's just too much evidence that in the raw, when the constraints of civilization fall away, we behave in the most savage way to one another. I'm a big believer that with the inherited wisdom of a 2 millennia-old religion, we've got a pretty good framework to work with." That's astonishing. And as I said, last week he said, "I now go to church, and I'm, I suppose, a Christian." He said, "I love going to church. I come away every week having learned something from the hymns, the prayers, the readings, the sermon perhaps, although he didn't mention that, to think about. I know exactly what that's like. I look forward to Sunday, that hour or more of putting things into perspective. Now, what's happening in the intellectual world is fascinating. I mean, let me start further back. Where did I put it? Here it is. This is from 1966. Listen to this. The adherents of a great tradition are largely unaware of their own premises, which lie deeply embedded in the unconscious foundations of practice. If the citizens are dedicated to certain transcendent obligations, and particularly to such general ideals as truth, justice, charity, and these are embedded in the tradition of the community to which an allegiance is maintained, a great many issues between citizens, and all to some extent, can be left and are necessarily left for individual consciences to decide. The moment, however, a community ceases to be dedicated through its members to transcendent ideals, it can continue to exist undisrupted only by submission to a single centre of unlimited secular power. That's Michael Polanyi writing in 1966. Michael Polanyi was a Hungarian. I don't know much about his belief system. If anybody knows of a good account of that, I'd be interested. I ought to be able to find out if I could contact his son, who's a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry at the University of Toronto. I haven't tried. Maybe I should. But these people tend to be hard to get to. But he's pointing out something very important. And it sounds to me as though he's probably got a Jewish background, but I don't know. He lived in Hungary, and he was pushed into thinking about these things because in 1917, when the Russian Revolution took place, he, being in Hungary, realized it would have an impact on Hungary very quickly if it succeeded. He actually went to a conference in Moscow on science and asked the Soviet Minister of Science, what will your science policy be? And he got the Marxist answer, the proletariat will tell the scientists what to do. Well, he knew that was a recipe for no science. We're seeing that. COVID was a good example of what happens when uneducated, effectively proletariat deal with what is essentially much more than a purely medical problem, but an ethical problem. It involves the nature of children growing up. It involves their own understanding of life and death, etc., etc. And he knew that all this stuff was going to get wrecked. And it was wrecked. Years later, in the University of St. Petersburg, a student said to me when I asked about what it was like growing up in the Soviet Union, she said, the worst part was they destroyed the meaning of the word trust. But I didn't read Polanyi in 1966, but I started moving in that direction a bit before that. A good friend gave me Leslie Newbegin's Foolishness to the Greeks in the 80s. I reread that book every other year or so at least and dip into it frequently. Newbigin had been a missionary in India for a long while, and he'd gone as a liberal missionary, actually, from a liberal church, wanting to do good. And he came back as an evangelical because he realized that the liberal approach, India would simply make Jesus another god to go with all the others. And he began to realize that, no, the gospel is about a person, Christ, who claims that he will come and live in you, with you, and change your life. And he was very interested in science, and he started looking at science and realizing how much of science and how much of faith is knowledge which doesn't count as knowledge to the modern liberal. That's their problem. They have reduced wisdom to knowledge. Very, very silly thing to do. Wisdom and knowledge are different. I've talked recently about the distinction between being an ethics based on being reasonable, which takes your cultural story seriously, and an ethics that claims to be rational, that doesn't make the ethicist ethical. Not a good idea. So tacit knowledge is something I have to say just a word or two about. it'll come up again. It's probably come up before, but it's such a powerful idea, and Christians in particular, but others too, need to realize that it matters in science. And it's in science that Newbegin was showing how it worked. Tacit knowledge is what you know to be true without being able to give a rational account of it. That doesn't mean it's irrational. It's actually suprarational. But for somebody who's had a genuine conversion to faith that changes their life, Augustine would be a good example. Nobody could deny how big the change was. But he says in the opening paragraph of his letters, he says, there is a God-shaped hole in everybody. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. This first paragraph of the Confessions, a book you should have beside your bed. A good way to see that your mind is a bit cleaner than it could otherwise be as you go to sleep, give you better sleep. A slow read. You can miss quite a lot of the first chapters where he fusses over pinching a few apples as a kid, but for him it mattered. But it's full of incredible insights. The first, Tell It As It Happened, where he heard children in a tree down the way in another garden shouting, open the book, read it, open the book, read it. And he had the Bible in his hands. He had the New Testament. And of course, when he opened it, its time is well spent. Now it's time to wake up in Romans. And he did. And that knowledge he never forgot. You can't give a reductive account of conversion. You can't say, if you do get these things right and change these chemicals, you'll become a Christian. Now, that there are changes in my neuro that when I have an insight which is spiritual, surely it's happening in my mind. So neurotransmitters are involved. That's how we know that much. But that's a correlation-causation phenomenon, which there are always in every other context that would immediately point out, but not in that context. You cannot reduce the most important things in our life to neurophysiology. They're deeper than that. When you fall in love, it's deeper than that. When God shows you his love, it's even deeper still. And it is a long, slow process. I rather enjoy meeting someone who I knew when I was an active scientist, coming to a lecture I'm giving on entirely different subjects in the university. And on one occasion, I remember well, a guy came up and said, oh, hello, I haven't seen you for a while. I said, no, I don't go to the meetings where we used to meet. And he said, yeah, I know. I used to read your stuff until the mid-90s, clearly implying that I lost my mind in the mid-90s. I said, do you think I lost it? And he said, well, you write rubbish now, don't you? I said, well, I think I can prove that's wrong. And I said, when someone loses their mind, what happens to their life? Well, falls apart. Yeah, right. It gets worse, doesn't it? Not better. Even my wife would tell you when I started taking faith seriously, our lives got better, not worse. So my writing now is not irrational, but it is super rational from your point of view, and you haven't got an envelope to put it in. You're the one with the limited output. I mean, you only have to look at the number of people who hold the views of faith that I hold. I'm not ashamed of the list, just to take one sequence. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, who comes next on that list. He goes on to Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington. That's not a bad list just for one bit of science. All of those are serious Christians. 4 of them would be called evangelical today. So, no, you need to rethink. I don't know whether he did. I hope he did. The best example today, of course, is John Lennox, who's absolutely brilliant at this. I mean, emeritus professor from Oxford, looks like everybody's favourite grandfather with a mind like a razor blade. Just if you want the fun of seeing someone very gently and graciously pricking the balloons of the liberal elite, just go and watch him. He's better watched. I mean, he's written some nice little books as well. He wants to communicate, not to show how good he is. He's delightfully humble. And, watch him on YouTube. John Lennox's last words to the world, it's the last one I saw. It's lovely, but you see him at Harvard, he debated Dawkins twice and took him down on both occasions, and Dawkins would never touch him again. That's the way it's going. And even Dawkins recognizes some of what I read to you, that there are people out there who love the church, particularly Douglas Murray, for instance, who's not a Christian. He says, also a Christian, he's an active homosexual, but he says, why are we destroying the most beautiful things we have? The King James Version of the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, religious music. Yeah, he's right. So much that we have, we forget where it comes from. It's very dangerous when you lose a sense of who your parents are. You should think very carefully when you find yourself doing that. So, that's just one example. Tacit knowledge. Conversion is tacit knowledge. You know that something happened to you. It's utterly undeniable. It's a central reality of your life. Can you explain it mechanistically? No. Doesn't mean it's not true. Children say it's not fair before they can pass a sentence. They know what fairness is. They didn't work that out. It's hardwired. Now, in science, you have moments of tacit knowledge. That's why you can't predict science. You take notice of something that pops up in the periphery of what you're doing and realize, oh my goodness, that's interesting. And you realize it has some importance. You have no idea what it was at the time. And it goes on and turns into something great. That's wonderful. Einstein said of, it's a terrible elderly problem. I mentioned his name a moment ago, Clark Maxwell. A very curious little boy growing up in a very Presbyterian home with an incredible mind. As a little boy, he knew all the Psalms by heart. And a game he liked to play with people says, tell me a verse from the Psalms and I'll tell you which Psalm, which verse. And he could do that. It made big effort. And he wanted to know where every wire in the house went or what it was for. And of course he ended up founding the most famous, the most successful laboratory in the world in terms of Nobel Prizes, the Cambridge Laboratory. And over the door, he put from the Psalms in the hundreds, great are the works of the Lord, greatly sought after by those who love him. And when they built the new building, all the people there said, you've got to keep that text over the door, even though they weren't Christian. They knew enough about Clark Maxwell to know that it was a driving force in his life. So tacit knowledge is very important. When you fall in love, you know you've fallen in love. When it's the real thing, you know it even better. Tacit knowledge. So think about it and look for it. How do you know that somebody's got a disease? Most of the time, you just know. You don't go through the process of starting from pathophysiology and working. No, bells ring and you put one, and then you test it. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's why medicine is very good for bringing you to truth if you're willing to be open about it. Now, back to this question of what's going on in these people. The list there is all about people who are trying to be intellectually honest. That's the key. Now, it goes back to a book, in my view. I'd be happy to be corrected and taken further back, but Ideas Have Consequences by Weaver is certainly it had a huge impact on some people. A lot of people hated it, of course, because of what it was saying along these lines. And if you want to listen to one of the names on the list, Roger Scruton, there is a Weaver lecture, and he gave it a few years ago, so you could track it down. Now, Roger Scruton, nobody knows for certain what he believed. As far as I can tell, he didn't openly confess, as some of the others will. But he did play the organ in church. He did say the Anglican Church is central to the survival of England. He was very concerned about how you preserve what is good in a culture. Now, he was one of the first people to be cancelled many years ago and when he was a young academic in London, and he got cancelled for his views. So you get mad. He went behind the Iron Curtain and taught there underground. He's almost considered a saint in the Czech Republic because of what he did for them, keeping alive the tradition of real learning based on a Judeo-Christian history, with its views of a maker, a creator, who's ordered, and therefore order can be sought even in what looks at first sight like chaos. It's the only religion in the world that supports science. And as we move away now, you can see the Nobel Prizes in many cases now are being given for political reasons, and they're given for technique. Really major moves forward appear to be few and far between. That's a sign of a diminishing intellectual environment. It's undeniable, I think. So Scruton has written a lot of very good books. And those of you interested in music and beauty, he made a wonderful program for the BBC. They don't market it because he's politically incorrect, but you can still find it. It was BBC Scotland, Scruton on beauty and music, as well as writing a lot of books on philosophy and politics. He's written an opera. He's a polymath, but he's dead now, sadly. But you can find him, listen to him on YouTube and places like that. Unheard and Uncommon Knowledge, two websites where you find a lot of these people. So Scruton is honoured by all these guys. Now, Jordan Peterson, many of you are watching, and he's on the edge, and I hope he tumbles over into grace completely very soon. I had the privilege, actually, many years ago, of being at a conference in Seattle for a Catholic family group, and astonishingly, the three main speakers were all from Canada, and none of them were Catholic. I was one, Jordan Peterson was the other, and Jonathan Pageau was the other. And when I asked why, of the guy who picked me up at the airport, he was a nerd, he said, well, just scroll down on in my car. And he got a bunch of my talks, a bunch of Jordan Peterson's talks. I said, so you like listening to us? I've got that far, but why? He said, well, sadly, the Catholic material, which we use with the young people, they doesn't engage, but you and Jordan Peterson get under their skin. That's why we've asked you to come. And he wasn't famous at the time. I'd heard that he was having trouble in the PC variety in the University of Toronto, but listening to him at that conference was a lot of fun, and I was impressed. He was kind to me as well, which was nice. And a few months later, somebody sent me an email and said, I just watched that conference's material, and you got a bit there that you couldn't buy for advertising, because Jordan Peterson is clearly paying attention to you in the question period that came up at the end, which I thought it lasted 20 minutes. Apparently it lasted well over an hour. He said it's about halfway through, and he clearly has never thought about the Sermon on the Mount, and you used it at that point. But I've never followed up. I should. I'd love to know, because he's engaging with the Sermon on the Mount now, but he's so distant that I haven't the energy or means to pierce the many barriers of privacy that are built around him. But when I read his first book, I thought, well, it's sad that it has to be written, because the rules for life are all commonplace for anybody with a proper education. But he told me even back then that it's astonishing to walk down the street and have young men come up to you and say, you're Jordan Peterson, and then thank you for what you've done for them. He said, that's deeply moving. And I agreed, that is deeply moving. I don't have it walking down the street, but I get a little stream of people who thank me in the same sort of way. And that's incredibly moving. It does move you to tears. So the next one on that list there is Tom Holland. And Tom Holland is a historian who writes beautifully. And the book you should read, if you haven't read it, is Dominion. And the best place to see him lay out what's happening to him, I think, is a wonderful interview on the Unbelievable website, in which he's talking to Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, who I think is the best Protestant theologian currently alive. And Tom Holland says to Tom Wright, he said, I began as I pursued this process of writing history to realize that what I really appreciated in the Western world all came from the Judeo-Christian narrative. I couldn't deny that. That's where its roots always went back to. And then he says something like this. I've probably not got it quite right, but I'll do the best I can. He says, it looks to me as though Jesus and Paul planted a bunch of time bombs into our culture that are still going off to this day. And Tom Wright nods vigorously. It's lovely to watch. He realised the time bombs are going off, and he has now said, yeah, I'm a Christian now. That's astonishing. Now, to go back to where we started with this story with Neil Ferguson. The first book of Neil Ferguson's I read was sent to me by a dentist, a good friend. He did me a lot of good at that point. And it was Civilization. Now, the book, near the beginning, he sets out what he calls the 5 or 6 apps of civilization. I looked down the list. They're all commonplace. They're all acceptable to the liberals, more or less. And he, at that time, was definitely put in the liberal camp, although conservative in many ways, but acceptable to the liberal elite. And having been taught in both Harvard and Oxford, he's now at the Hoover Institute in Stanford. But I said, that's not the reason he's writing this book. He's got something to say that he doesn't want to take ownership of. I wonder what it is. And he doesn't tell me what it is. Here's the book, Civilization. You can see which way around. It's near the end. It's page 287 out of 300 odd. And he says this, he's gone to China. This was published when, let me just look. First published 2011. So over 10 years ago, 15 years ago nearly. And he is talking to Chinese academics. And he writes this, according to one scholar from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who wrote, we were asked to look into what accounted for the preeminence of the West all over the world. At first we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. 2011. He was open to saying it there. And then just a little lower, another academic says, only by accepting this understanding of transcendence as our criterion can we understand the real meaning of such concepts as freedom, human rights, tolerance, equality, justice, democracy, the rule of law, universality, and environmental protection. He knew back then. And he has said that he realized as a historian. Toynbee also said that no culture that gives up its religion is going to flourish. It will fade away fairly quickly. We're in a dangerous spot. You may be in a dangerous spot. If you are, move to a safer one. But look around and work on this.